Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we give you an explanation for why we often seem to be so darn wishy washy. Where is our backbone? Why don't we just come down firmly on a side in some of these conversations? Well, we hope you'll discover in this episode we actually do have a backbone, and we have some very definitive reasons for why we're careful with our speech and why we're also careful when we're dealing with current events, but particularly with our political climate. Stick around, this will be enjoyable to you. We have some book recommendations, and if you're a Thinking Out Loud listener, you love reading as well. So, hey, that'll be fun. And like, share, and subscribe as always. And if you want to support our work, you can do that by going to www.toltogether.com.
Cameron, we have a listenership of Thinking Out Loud that is phenomenal. You guys write us such interesting and nuanced and thoughtful questions and critiques and pushbacks. It's great. But every once in a while, somebody will come into our content for the first time and be like, what in the world is going on here? These guys are a bunch of spinally, wishy washy, middle of the road. And then there's all kinds of other critiques that could go along with that line of thinking, where there's a deep misunderstanding of what it is that we're actually trying to do here. And so in this episode, we want to, particularly in light of some of the continued cultural conversations around everything from Charlie Kirk to free speech, work out a little bit of like, what is it that Thinking Out Loud is actually saying when we're trying to think Christianly about political and cultural issues. And let's just put some cards on the table here as we go forward. Cameron, there have been some comments recently made on Instagram, some other of the places which we've engaged with people, where you're like, I think people are misunderstanding the what it is that we're up to when they're just jumping in on the conversation in a new way. So for those more recent listeners, can you help bring us up to speed here a little bit on some of the concerns and challenges and some of the differences of the way that you and I are engaging these compared to the rest of YouTube?
At best, our tone is thoughtful. At worst, for some people, I think we can sound very tentative and like we're very indecisive and that we're wishy washy and that we don't have a backbone or something like
And
that.
on some issues, we
And
are that
these,
because we don't like nobody knows and there's no information. But then when we get into the political categories, people really want you to have very, very clearly defined. Anyway, so there are some categories in which we're like, yeah, we don't know yet.
yeah, and the nature of what we're doing, thinking out loud about current events, some current events are unfolding in real time. And part of one of the symptoms of our age is that people have the ability to spout off an opinion and to go off on rants when we don't have sufficient information. We try to err on the opposite side of that trend, probably not always successfully. So that's one reason for the somewhat tentative tone. But I want to talk about something different, a more serious charge, and which is that these are very serious times and the stakes are very high politically. Look at the state of our nation. We are in a place of cultural disintegration. And there's consensus on this. A lot of different, very incisive voices are saying this, and just we as the people, as citizens, speak. Nathan, we are aware we have international listeners, but this is Nathan and I speaking as Americans. We feel that in our nation. We feel not just the deep division, but a real sense that of the erosion of our cultural institutions. At the very least, there is massive, massive distrust and
I think that's true
fear
across
and
the English
anger and
speaking world,
paranoia.
though. So, I mean, obviously, our podcast, like 80% of you are in the US, and then probably another 16% are Canada, Australia, England, and then 150 of you are non primarily English speaking countries. But I think if you look at all of those commonwealths or other political systems, you could say the same thing for the UK right now. You could say the same thing for Australia right now. You could say certainly the same thing for Canada right now. So even though we're speaking in the American political scene, there is a deep resonance on some of these tactics and topics, I think, for Christians across all these countries.
Yeah. So that's the vibe on the ground right now. That is the atmosphere. The mood is one of pessimism, of fear, of deep uncertainty. One way to measure this very easily, and I owe this thought to Nathan, so I'm just going to steal it just brazenly right now, Nathan, but give you credit.
I gift it to you.
But Nathan, you said, thank you, thank you. You said about a year ago or so that 50 years ago, that's not that long ago. But generally speaking, in the past, people were fairly sanguine about the future. They thought, we're facing a lot of challenges, but all things being equal, we can rise to those
Yeah, we're
challenges
up
and
for
we
the
can meet the
task.
challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so people expected good things. That's not the case now, especially the younger the person, the more the future is seen as something bleak, something to avoid. I mean, and I think many people just are in what I would characterize as a mild form of survival mode. Let's just get through the day. Don't talk to me about the
Mm,
future. Let's try to just make it to the end of this week here. And that, you can point to a lot of factors that are contributing to that. There many of them are economic, of course, especially for young people. You have crippling student debt for many people. You got the housing market going on. You have inflation going on. And then there are larger concerns. A lot of young people are deeply concerned, of course, about looming ecological catastrophes. There are a lot of factors contributing here. But again, I'm just describing the mood and kind of the vibe that's on the ground. So this is the environment where people want confidence. They want
mhm.
definitive answers. They want, and I don't want to, I'm trying to steel man this. They want people of integrity, yes, but who are strong enough to meet these challenges and actually come up with real feasible solutions. But in order to do that, you're going to have to make some hard decisions, so the thinking goes. And you may even have to make some compromises, so the thinking goes. You're going to have, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. These are difficult times. We're facing existential threats. And so we're going to have to meet these challenges and we're going to have to be very serious about it and do some serious stuff. So you're going to have to pick a side. And it may not be pretty, it may not be glamorous, but all of that needs to take a back seat for this moment. Okay. So that is the context and that is an expectation. And let's add to this also the fact, Nathan, that you and I are Christians, outspoken Christians. So as outspoken Christians, we do believe we have the correct vision of reality. We do believe we see things as we are in the greatest sense. And we do believe we follow the one who has the words of eternal life.
Yeah.
So
Here,
why
here.
not why can't we be yeah, so why can't we bring that level of certainty, that level of confidence into our political moment? So that's just me, this is just me setting up
Yeah.
the scenario here.
Mhm.
Let me bring in a few thoughts and then I'm going to kick it over to Nathan. First of all, Nathan and I think would like to give you a source text if you're up for a reading assignment that will help make sense of both Nathan and our approach, and it'll make a lot of sense of thinking out loud. But a book that was very influential for many people, but for Nathan and I certainly. And I will also say this book, we reference it all the time. It's James Davison Hunter's To Change the World. But here's the thing. When when Nathan and I first read it, we were in a context where there were quite a few people around us who did not like this book, who thought that maybe it gave a good diagnosis, but that its solutions were off the mark. But I think now history, well, not history, but the events of the present have so vindicated this book to an almost comical level. If you read it now, it does read like a full-blown prophecy. So if you're up for it, it I don't think it's not that long of a book and it's really well written. So To Change the World, if you've not read that, that's just a fun assignment. It's fun
Mm.
fun at
It
least for
it steps
us.
on everybody's toes. That's and I sometimes teach a course on that actually, in concepts of
Mhm.
Christianity and cultural engagement that I do for an online group. Um, but yeah, I like it because it certainly steps on everybody's toes, and it hopefully gets the wheels turning and thinking about what are we trying to do here in the first place, and what's successful and what isn't. So yeah.
Okay, so there's an assignment, and now I wanna bring in one philosophical position and then one sociological argument, and then I'm gonna kick it over to Nathan. The philosophical position is something that both Nathan and I are sympathetic to. I would be comfortable labeling us both in this sense, but both Nathan and I are what if you had to categorize us, we would be virtue ethicists. Just a few, and I actually let me kick it over to Nathan after I say a few words about this because I think he needs to weigh in here also. But Virtue ethics is concerned not necessarily first and foremost with outcomes, that would be, consequentialism, but it's really concerned with who you are and what kind of a person you are becoming, hence the word virtue. A key source text for virtue ethics would be Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And the idea really is that if you want the word that Aristotle uses is eudaimonia. There are, of course, big scholarly squabbles fought in the trenches of footnotes over what this word precisely means, but I think we could say flourishing, and that's relatively uncontroversial. But the notion of a flourishing society, Aristotle argues, depends on virtuous people. And if you are a virtuous person, if you cultivate the virtues, and a key structuring feature of virtue for Aristotle is going to be the golden mean. So a virtue is kind of between two extremes. So courage is between is between the two extremes of, on the one hand, cowardice, and on the other hand, recklessness. That's a really easy one to point to. And the idea is not that you always come down in the middle in everything, but the idea is that you have balance and wisdom guiding you. But the bigger idea is that if you cultivate virtuous citizens of the polis, then you will have people who are making wise and just decisions, and you have a wise and just society. I think Nathan will say a little bit more about this. You can go to Aristotle, but you don't need to go to a pagan philosopher. We Christians have a probably perhaps a deeper and better precedent for this, but also this is a strong tradition among the founding fathers of our nation as well. But Nathan, let's hear you weigh in here a little bit
Yeah,
as well.
so I wanna I'll get there. I wanna point out that for me, all of this thinking is not Aristotle, it's Christ in the New Testament, and we'll get there, but yeah, so if you think about the foundational concepts behind what our founding fathers thought would make a representative democracy work, it was all virtue ethics. I mean, you can and that wasn't just the founding fathers, that was a national mood at the time, and it carried on for I mean, if you go read Henry David Thoreau, like, he was appalled at the idea that you would need a police force in a town. Like, what is wrong with humans that they can't, based on the principles that they have, know not to trespass or to steal or to cheat or to have dishonest skill? Like, an aghast, like if people lived virtuous lives, obviously this would work and we would need way less government. So there's a little bit of idealism for sure on human nature in some of that, but we do live in the United States in a system that was built around the idea that self-governance, that self-control, that you could behave yourself, that you didn't need external restraints in order to choose to do the right thing that was good for your neighbor, for the land, and for yourself, and your family. That was seen as pretty obvious. And so I think if you look at the language of cultural loss and decay, a lot of people are going to see that in the categories of the loss of political power from a Christian vision. Cameron and I are more likely to see this as a loss of virtue, as a spiritual degradation, and an inability of our political structure to form citizens that are the type of citizens necessary to live within the political system that was originally set up for us to live in. And so it's not that we don't care about whatever politician or pundit is tweeting this morning. It's just that we see the problems to be existentially far deeper than most of the patty cake games that are being played in the different political parties today. We are far more pessimistic in a conservative cultural sense than anybody else that I know. We're far more optimistic about the outcome of this because we're Christians, but our pessimism on the cultural moment runs far deeper than something that neatly fits in a partisan political sentiment. And so it seems like the wrong tools in the wrong game to address the real issues, and that's a little bit of where we're coming from on that. Now,
And
here's the
just to
thing.
yeah.
Yeah, finish off that thought there, and I wanna say something.
Sure, just a bit of a crash course on how far we've moved there. So, as a nation, we are much more pragmatic. We're not, most of us are not drawn to any kind of an approach that emphasizes virtue formation. We're driven by results. and
But there's
practical outcomes and
so
results.
there's nothing wrong with pragmatism if it is bounded by consciousness. And I think the
Mhm.
same thing would be absolutely true if even if you think of a free market of capitalism. That isn't a moral category, but it needs a moral boundary and conscientiousness to go alongside it in order for it not to be have everything totally reduced down into economics and power. So there again, there are many things that we argue about, and it's their tools and their avenues and their structures, but really the content of the person holding the tool or the weapon um, is the deeply
Yeah.
formative thing here. Yeah. So this
Oh, and
is
tools are wonderful.
yeah, we're not saying anything new here. We're we're like
No.
197-year-old 30-year-olds speaking to you here of like if you want a vision of humanity and the quote the way things used to be, and we never lived up to these ideals, let's be clear on that. But there was much even within our if you think of classical education or in our educational structures, it was way more around even if I go to my local the local public school that my kids go to, and you read the value statements that are there for today, it's all around, um, the idea is that you're producing, uh, citizens of character that can make contributions to society and the world and the lives of the people around them. Now, what that has to do with, like, filling in bubbles for state testing, there's no connection there, but I'm saying, like, in the core of the educational system of our country, sure, there's a part of it of producing factory workers, but at a deeper philosophical idea that education was to produce like
Mhm.
competent citizens who could self-govern.
Yep. Yeah, and just a note on that, so as late as in the late 19th century, for instance, most of our colleges, and certainly the really, the Yales and the Harvards, and then what would eventually become Columbia University, had included what would be called a cap what was a capstone course, usually taught by the university professor. And by the way, if you want,
Or
my
president.
source on this is yeah, right, is sorry, the university president, but the source here is it's a book called The Making of the Modern University, and the subject of that book, it's a fascinating intellectual history, involves the separation of truth and morality. But in the late 19th century, the university president would lead a capstone course, and it was basically about how to lead a good life, how to lead a virtuous,
Mhm.
fulfilling life as a citizen, and how to contribute to your community. Now, we've never lived up to this ideal completely, absolutely not. I mean, we are in a fallen world, but there were times in the American past where this ideal was better modeled or on more vivid display than it is today. You did have a time in American life where communities took care of their members and didn't necessarily require the kind of heavy-handed sort of
Federal intervention.
interventions that we do, yeah, that we do today, because they kind of, I mean, they knew one another. There was a sense. So, did you have the town drunk and the troublemakers? Yes, of course, but people knew them and knew who they were, and there are even jokes about this in some of our old television shows where even something like the Andy Griffith Show, there's the town drunk, and they routinely will put him in the cell and let him sleep it off there. Now, we can laugh that off as so much sentimentalism, but there's an element of truth to that. And we've talked before about how the more you move away from the ability to self-govern, that's the kind of political or crude way of putting it, but the more we move away from virtue formation in citizens, which all the founding fathers were, to a man, convinced was absolutely essential for America to function properly, the more you move away from that, the more power you have to cede to the government to come in and
Yeah,
change your diaper
exactly.
and
Yep.
take care of you, which is where we're at right now. So,
Yeah.
and not just in
Well,
America, like you said, that's the West. Yep.
let me say something here, Cameron, that I think that virtue ethics disconnected from theology is dangerous. So I'm not an Aristotelian virtue ethicist. I'm not a deistic virtue ethicist. I'm a Christian virtue ethicist.
Mhm.
And the reason that this is important here is that there could be a sense in which there's a more monastic, like a secular monastic view of virtue ethicism, where I'm going to withdraw from society. I'm going to, get in my little hermit hut, and I'm going to work on the formation and the structure of my character and I only care about my own virtue. I don't care about what's happening to other people. It's a very me centered. And actually, in a recent podcast, actually we released last week with Mike Gary, we talked about even spiritual disciplines can become very self centered and self seeking. So that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about virtue ethics, because for the Christian, we're modeling our lives off of a person who has revealed the fullness of truth in bodily form to us in the will of God, which means that we're um, being conformed to the image of the one who created and cares for and loves the world and the people in it the best. And so there's
Mhm.
inherently, as I grow in character, I grow in competence for the service of the other, for the glory of God. But it's a very outward facing personal development. I know that sounds like a bit of a contradiction, but it is a unique type of it's not a I'm hiding from the problems of the world and I'm just caring about me and mine. I'm going to circle the wagons. That's not what we get from Christ. And so as we think about becoming like Christ, there's an inherent political nature to it, not in a Republican Democrat sense, but in a I'm engaging with the problems of the
Common
world
good.
around me, a common good. I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and get involved in things that I don't have to for the sake of the other. My neighbor's
Mhm.
problem is also my problem. There's an incarnational element to a tangible and a tangible way in which we get involved in the lives of others. So that being said, I think this does come back though to is there is a deeper question outside of our political question of like what is God doing in the world and how do his people fit into the world? And let me just lay out a theological distinction here that might be helpful, which is to say you have two primary Christian ways of thinking about the world, and whichever camp you fall into will pretty deeply influence your politics. One is so you think about the fact that Israel largely disappeared after the Roman conquest in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't a category. So when you look at the history of the church fathers, you look at the Reformation, you look at the history of the Catholic Church, you look at the Puritans, you look at the early American settlement, you look at the Christians who are coming in the first wave, all of them, well, not all of them, but a huge chunk of that saw themselves as the new Israel, that the church was the people of God. There wasn't a nation of Israel for most of Christian church history. It didn't like nobody was like, well, what about what's going on in Jerusalem? No, it wasn't Israel. Um, and I'm not making any kind of statement about the political state, anything. I'm just saying in the psyche of the history of Christianity, the church was Israel, and deeply in the theology of the Protestant Puritan movement in North America, is they saw America as a new Israel and name things after that. You can go look at Winthrop up in New England, Plymouth Rock, the sermons of a sense in which America is a new theocratically structured and oriented concept and way of doing a nation and a country together. So that's one vision, is that America was inherently a a political vision rooted in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament gives us our framework for how it is that we live and behave and how we set things up and structure laws and all of that. That's one vision, which I do think is heavily rooted in a interesting relationship and interpretive framework between the Old and the New Testament, but it does look to the Old
Mhm.
Testament for the core values. And that's where that crew would bring along concepts like Judeo Christian or have a big emphasis on the 10 Commandments, for example, because you're looking at the Mosaic Law as the structure of the foundational values for the country in which you live in the modern time. And if that is your paradigm, then obviously you're going to see this as a war between those who are supporting that and those who aren't. And you're going to need to, in Old Testament biblical fashion, to be engaged in certain battles and conflicts and use power appropriately and discern the will of God in order to structure society around um, a vision of what it is that God wants. So that's one paradigm. There's another paradigm that I think draws more deeply on the New Testament, which is you live in Babylon. The cultural war was lost. Satan is the prince of the world. The cultural war is over. He is referred to as the God of the age. Jesus talks about in like John 12 and John 14 and multiple references in Corinthians and all the way through that the game is over as far as political power goes. And you one time said, Cameron, I was asking you like, oh, how do you talk to your kids about some of the stuff that they see happening in the world? And you said you remind them that they live in Babylon. So, as an American citizen, do you live in Israel or do you live in Babylon? That's the question. And
Mm.
if you live in Babylon, how do you so if you live in Israel, how do you want to work as a modern Christian Israelite in order to establish that vision? Or if you see that you live in Babylon, how do you live in that context? And in the New Testament, you get this clear teaching from things like First Peter, who says, look, you don't fit here, you don't belong here, this is not your final destination, you're just sojourners, you're just passing through, and you're going to suffer deeply because the world is evil. And in the middle of your suffering, we want you to live holy lives as a testimony to your hope in Christ and that he will return and make all things new. Our hope is in Jesus for the restoration of the world. And Jesus is the one who fixes and brings about a political order that reestablishes and fixes everything. But the game is up, basically, for the vast majority of Christians. And that's true even to this day. Um, if you look outside of your representative democracies and you look at the brutality of the slaughter happening to the Nigerian Christians right now, it's not because they're not voting correctly that they're all dying. So, how do you live in the context of that? Is you
Mm.
live holy lives with faith in Christ, conform to his image, to do the best amount of work in helping forming communities and serving the poor and the outcast and loving your neighbor and your enemy. And you live as a witness to the coming kingdom of God. And you develop in Christ likeness and virtue in that sense. And Jesus is going to ultimately be the one. It is the plan of God to restore the heavens and the earth. Now, some of you are obviously going to say, hey, that's a false dilemma to set up those two dichotomies. But for the sake of just getting you to think, I want to lay those out there as two
Mhm.
different Christian visions of what's happening right now. And if you're coming at this from a more political vision of a New Testament perspective in that sense, then you are going to see a lot of the religious political conversation as ridiculous, if not embarrassing, because you don't have a dog in that fight, so to speak. You might be interested in it, but the foundation of your hope is not embedded deeply in it. And so, Cameron, you better save me here and put some nuance on the distinctives of the categories that I've made. But one of those is a call to virtue and to character and to formation and to
Mhm.
live well in a time of suffering. And the other is a call to figure out the avenues of power and restructure society.
We can point to an interesting, fascinating historical exchange that embodies the two paradigms as well, just to add some clarity. And that would be you mentioned Winthrop, and the other interlocutor in that conversation was Roger Williams, who advocated very strongly for a separation of church and state on the basis of pretty much what Nathan was talking about, the proper expectations of, "Hey, you live in Babylon. That doesn't mean that while in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do, but it means that
No, you
your
seek the good of the city.
expectations
You plant a garden and make
you seek the
babies.
good of the city."
I mean, that's the
Right.
Jeremiah,
I mean, how
what you
did
do in exile. Yeah.
that's the Jeremiah paradigm. How did Daniel live when he was in Babylon? I mean, there's another wonderful example that we can look to. But let me bring in one more argument that is a bit peculiar to the United States, but increasingly it kind of has gone viral, as they might say these days. But and I think this will and then I think we'll have to make a few remarks about how this applies to just our approach on thinking out loud, and we'll try to make that concise because the time is getting away from us, which is another way of saying Nathan and I are getting older, getting more long-winded. But in 1964, the sociologist Richard Hofstadter released a book that remains in print to this day, and it's called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And again, you want to talk about a book that reads like a full blown prophecy. Now, the word style is really important here. He is talking about a general style that characterizes all different all sides of the political aisle. So this is not restricted to one. He's an equal opportunity offender here, but he's looking at the tendency in America to gravitate in times of great economic uncertainty and cultural upheaval. So that's where we are right now, by the way. He wrote this in the 1960s, so that was a time of great economic uncertainty and cultural upheaval. Everything was changing. Sexual mores were changing. You had very unpopular wars being fought, all sorts of things like that, global conflicts. So that's what we find ourselves in. I don't even have to make an argument. We're in such a time again when that happens, the population, Americans, are particularly prone to conspiracy theories. And there are conspiracy theories that construes the current situation as not just another election or not just politics, but an existential threat where the stakes are very high. Apocalyptic language is used. There's the notion of a secret, shadowy society or cabal who are secretly controlling the levers of power. Now, some of the examples that he gives throughout history are there was in the 1800s, there was a big conspiracy theory concerning the Freemasons. And the idea was the Freemasons, because I mean, they are, sort of shadowy secret society. I mean, that's true, but that they were controlling elections. And
or
so
the
there
or
was a whole lot
Catholicism,
of
the Irish,
so
the
that's the
Jews.
next one he gives is yeah, so Catholicism was another one. A lot of us I think these are worth mentioning because these are ones that haven't been that aren't don't spring readily to mind anymore. They happened a while ago, but yeah, there was an elaborate conspiracy theory that the Pope of all people was going to undermine American democracy. And so there were the know nothings, and that became a whole movement against, the natalist anti-Catholicism movement. That was a big thing. And then, of course, McCarthyism. That's one that we will be familiar with. Senator Joseph McCarthy, who basically said, communism is a very grave danger. It's an existential threat. But hey, there's a conspiracy within, and there are communist agitators all around us, communist sympathizers all around us, and that led to this full blown kind of witch hunt. Today, we could probably point to. I mean, I think QAnon is
Mhm,
something that would not surprise Richard Hofstadter one bit. But so, but he's not. So bear in mind, he's not picking on one side, and he's isolating a style, a paranoid style that points to some hidden shadowy society, some conspiracy theory, and also that uses strong apocalyptic language. This is a civilizational moment. This is an existential threat. The very good of our nation is at stake. Democracy is being undermined. So
okay, hang on a
now,
second.
of course,
Hang on a
just
second,
yeah, let's just pause.
because there have been huge moments and there are real threats, and, like, just because there was a boy who
Yes,
cried wolf doesn't mean that wolves aren't real. I
which
think
he admits in the book, by the way.
yeah, so
So he
and
he
and
says
so
that.
some
Yeah.
of those were legitimately big moments, but
Mhm.
I'm agreeing with you here in the conclusion, but just to point out as you're listening along to this, A, you're not in new territory at all when you hear people speaking like this.
That's the takeaway. Yeah.
That's the
It's not
takeaway.
new. Yep.
But B, the the immediate response to that is, okay, how do we then gain and use power for our side of the
Right.
story? That is the
Which is
question.
where we're at. That's where we're at right now. And that's what happens in these moments. It's it's helpful that books like this are not you don't have to read these books, by the way, of course, but they can be immensely helpful in giving you the perspective of realizing, okay, this is not new. It's happened before, and here are typical responses, and here's how it is used. So let's apply some of this to what we do on the Thinking Out Loud podcast that might aggravate some of you, frankly. We're very aware. Nathan and I have a tendency to always take the wind out of people's sails who say, "Well, no, now is this feels different. This is a completely new moment, and these are real serious threats. We've never faced anything like this before." It's hard to, and this is where we always, yeah,
Well, hang
maybe,
on,
but not, maybe not so much.
but we start actually not in a political or a philosophical response. We're Christians. We've read to the end of the
Right,
story. That's
right.
that's where we're getting most of this from. It's not like we're just making stuff up and we're like like raining on the parade of those who enjoy rain on their parades. It's not that at all. It's a different vision of the possibilities. It's a realistic hope about where this all goes with people following
How about
Christ.
this? Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. I mean, that might be one way of characterizing part of what
And
structures our view of
a-
reality.
and I think also putting in there that death is not the worst thing that can happen to you.
That's a big one because one of the insidious ways we get sucked into non-Christian thinking and really godless thinking is to assume the default assumption that death is the worst thing that can ever happen to you because then it's game over. It's lights out. It's
Mhm.
curtains. Everything's over.
Which,
Except
if the resurrection is only
if you
symbolically true, that is the paradigm you need to be operating from.
then your host, we are of all men most to be pitied. Yeah, but if that's not true, then all of that's false. Death is not curtains. It's not the final end. It's not total annihilation. It's not the end of everything, and it's not the worst thing that could happen to you
So would you say,
either.
Cameron, then that we're trying to, if you listen to the music at the beginning of our podcast, you have these heavy tones. Cameron designed it this way,
Mhm.
these heavy tones and then these light pings. And that's not accidental. It's a dark paradigm with pings of light in it,
Yeah.
which reflects how we see the world. And it's good. God created it, said it's good. I get all of that, but sin is a real thing. There's a heavy darkness. We're strangers. There's a brokenness, the prince of this world. When Satan offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, Jesus didn't say, "Hey, you don't have the right to do that." He just rejected it of like, I'm not going to use power and bypass suffering to complete the task that God has for me. Um, and so that's the narrative here, is that we live with a tremendous amount of freedom and levity almost in a chaotic system, and we lament to see Christians being sucked into a more binding form of a smaller vision of hope than what we think God is actually offering them and that we have access to if we want to live consistently as people of the light. So yeah, is the
Mhm.
darkness real? Yes, but the light has come and the darkness has not overcome it. So there's a little bit of us trying, I think, as friends, working out together. That's why it's thinking out loud. We're working out together.
Yeah.
How do we live as men, as husbands, as fathers, as parents? How do we and our wives live and form a household in a community? And how do we think about the way in which we're involved in politics in the nation and the culture around us, centered out of what it is that Christ is calling us to do, out of a deep hope and a deep love and a affiliation with the light, not out of paranoia. Um,
So
and Christians operating in that sense, give us a sense of sadness, not hatred.
so I think another way, a clumsy way I want to put this, and I think Nathan will be on board, is that if you press us on what our political strategy is would be character formation. So
And
the
he's got the whole
idea
world in his
being,
hands.
yeah, well, that's your perspective. Your guiding perspective is he's got the whole world in his hands. Now, if you fall prey to the paranoid style, and if you live in America, now increasingly, the paranoid style is worldwide. It's global. It's gone viral. But if you live in America, it's very easy to do that. You have to intentionally resist it. But if you fall prey to the paranoid style, you think the whole world is in our hands.
And you're
God help us.
extremely susceptible to the next idea that offers a silver bullet and quick
You
salvation.
are you are very manipulable. And that's
And
why the
simplistic
paranoid style.
explanations will rocket around in
Mhm.
your mind. Single
So
causation,
you can
good and
see.
evil. It's easy.
Yep. So just to get real, very real here, and at the cost, at the risk of annoying you, this is why sometimes the whole why you point out deficiencies on all sides of the political aisle? That's not helpful right now. You need to make a firm and decisive decision. Well, if you are concerned more with your who you become with actual virtue, the words of our Lord are clean the inside of the cup first. Then you want to be very careful about what strategies you're employing, what tools you're using, and how they're shaping you in the process. Again, tools themselves are great, but tools that aren't guided by clear principles and strategies can become blunt instruments and can become weaponized, which happens all the time. But also, just practically speaking, fear is a very, very clever and very, well, not necessarily always clever, but it's a very effective political strategy. I mean, this is an ancient conversation. If you go back to the concern in ancient Greece regarding rhetoric, the speech of rhetoric was so powerful because you can get people to do stuff if with your speech. And one of the easiest ways to get people to do stuff is you scare them. You
Mm.
create a crisis. So
But
that's an
we believe
ever-present
crises are real.
reality.
They're just often at a spot where nobody's looking.
Yeah.
The deep
But if
crisis
you
would be
have
soul rot.
Mhm. But here's something else, Nathan, and I think there's growing recognition of this fact. And you hear it in outside the church, you hear this described as, well, we need to think more locally, we need to concentrate more on our own communities and local elections and all of that. But really, we can just speak explicitly as Christians and say, if more people follow follow Jesus and press into obedience to him, you can look at history. You can see actually one of the outworkings of that is amazing reforms in society. That
Yeah.
can and
And amazing
does
political
happen.
engagement and involvement and structures and institutions and the
All
whole
of it.
9 yards. Yeah.
And but it
But it's
happens in
secondary.
small
But
ways.
it's secondary. But
It's
it's
secondary.
secondary.
It's secondary. It's secondary. It's not, yeah, so this is not, that's why I hesitate to even use the phraseology political strategy. It is a byproduct, and in that sense, it's a political strategy, but the political strategy is a byproduct. But the key feature being, and even again, the founding fathers, whether they were Christian or not, recognized this, because if you press into virtue, then you have a citizenship that can handle freedom. And freedom is a wonderful thing. I think Nathan and I both would say, when it comes to freedom, we're fans. But we're
I'm
also
for it.
fans of
This club is
I'm for
formed.
it. But not only freedom from, freedom from all constraint and freedom from all that can go haywire, but freedom for. Freedom to be something, to be fully human, to flourish. Now, that's where we run into some difficulties right now as a society, because we cannot agree on what human beings are for. That's one of the big
Ah,
sources of
yeah.
division.
And that's because that is the danger of a non-theologically rooted virtue ethics. If I'm becoming
Yes.
a virtuous vision of a creature that only I have the vision of, that form of individualism has no bearing on any communal element. And so rampant individualism is the warping
Yeah.
of an
Now
attempt
that's
on
a
I'm gonna form my own character, but at the exclusion of the rest of reality and anybody else's opinion and lives.
that's an entire different podcast. We should do one on that, on the end of human beings, meaning telos. And I think, let me recommend a book for you if you're interested in that, because it's one thing to speak about it as a Christian, but it's hard to imagine doing that initially. I think the book that addresses that very well is C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And there he makes an appeal. I'm still not entirely settled on what I think about this, Nathan, and this is why I think we should do a podcast on it. But he makes the constellation of cherished values that have guided humanity down the ages. He puts them all under the heading of the Tao, or the way. And he includes elements of Confucianism in there, Christianity, Hinduism. The reason he's doing that is because the Abolition of Man was not written for a Christian audience. This was a series of lectures that he delivered in I believe it was at Oxford. So he is trying to make an appeal to, I think, natural law would be another way of saying this. He's trying to make an appeal that's not necessarily grounded explicitly in Christianity, so that he wants to try to get more agreement from those outside the church. I'm not entirely
I
sure
let me
of the
try something.
success of that paradigm, but it's a great book and it's really worth reading.
So I think there is a sense that you have maybe a statement from Confucius who says, "Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you." And there is a sense in which that resonates with the hearts of a lot of people, and there's a sense in which, like, yeah, we can do that, and that makes sense. It is restrictive though, of don't do what you don't want done. And so I think there's a sense in which natural law gives us some of those parameters, but Jesus goes beyond that and reverses it and says, do to others what you would have them do unto
Mhm.
you. And so there's a prescription to
It's a
the
positive
Christian.
now, yeah.
There's a positive vision in teleology here that's not restrictive but prescriptive on the way in which we are to engage. And so since Cameron and I are so deeply connected to trying to pursue and to grow in the way in which things are done, modeled after exactly what Christ taught us, that's when we sometimes throw some yellow flags on the play of things that are done even in the name of Christ to this day that are not in a Christ-like way, because you can't preach Christ in a non-Christ-like way and still call that Christianity. And so the way that we think about power, the way that we think about the other, the way that we think about humanity, all of these need to be consistent. You see extreme versions of irony of it when somebody, is so pro-life that they shoot somebody you're like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense because that's an internal contradiction. And so if we're looking at what it is that Christ is calling us to be like, maybe the Beatitudes, something like that,
Mm.
then those are the characteristics that we want to have formed in ourselves. And as a byproduct, let that ooze out into the community around us and then the culture and the world around us too. And so we want to be very hesitant of taking shortcuts that bypass the process that Christ has given us for how it is that we're supposed to live in difficult times as holy lives in the context of suffering. And so those are the types of questions that we think about on thinking out loud while we're processing current events and Christian hope. We are repeatedly the least surprised. I think if you have the vision, Cameron, that you live in Babylon and somebody's like, well, I just can't believe that somebody would shoot their political opponent. I can. Like, that seems exactly, I mean, and so there's a sense in which, yeah, that's like in this world
It
you will have
fits.
trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah, that looks right. Okay. No, I'm not saying that it's good, but it doesn't surprise us. We can be saddened by it and we can see it for what it really is. But then we can also avoid participating in the same terms. So that's why I think we're confusing, is because we don't fit the tidy narrative and rules and style of so much of the digital engagement and online platform conversations that we see in the world around us. And we really are trying to do things in a Christ-like way primarily. And your help is appreciated because we don't do this well ever. We're working on it. We're growing in that direction. So our attempt here is feeble, but it still seems that that God does more to change the world with people who are pursuing doing things His way than He does with the best laid plans of mice and men in all the other categories. And so it's one of those things, you don't know what will happen 3 years from now, but you do know how to respond to the things around you this day. And so that's what we're working on here. So stick with us, keep thinking with us, help any tidbits or insight or encouragement you have, or critique or pushback or challenge. We welcome that because we don't see, if you disagree with us, we don't have a separate category we don't have two categories, people who like us and people who don't.
Yeah.
That falls back into the same game. And so you can say, actually, we've got a really nice email this week of somebody say, hey, appreciate what you're doing. Couple quibbles here on this, and I say, hey, you know what? Those are actually good thoughts. We need to wrestle with that. That is the way that you treat your neighbors. That's the way you treat your family. That's the way we hope to engage the world around us in a realistic way of what it means to be a neighbor in a community. Not Don't slide into the overly narrow, divisive categories that come to you through your screens. Um, we know how this
Mm.
all ends.
You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.